In this episode, I have James Wilks from the Game Changers joining me to talk about whole food, plant-based diet and lifestyle. So in the month of January, I went 100% in on this. Nothing but whole food plants, and I absolutely loved it. I figured, hey, why don't I reach out to the expert himself who has spent thousands of hours studying this topic to educate me as well as all of you a little bit more. James and I talk about his background as well as what led him to this diet, what are some of the most common misconceptions, as well as the common pushbacks to a whole food plant-based diet, and a whole lot more. I hope you enjoy this one.
The Prehab audio experience will teach you how to take control of your health through knowledge by optimizing performance, promoting longevity, and keeping your movement system in tune. Welcome to your host, the Prehab Guys.
Today we have James Wilks, an elite special forces trainer, the Ultimate Fighter winner, and one of the producers of the popular film, The Game Changers, here to talk about plant-based lifestyles and more. James, it's an honor to have you join the show. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
I'm stoked for this. I just watched Game Changers again last night. And then just a little bit about myself. All of January, I did 100% plant-based diet, my wife and I. So I'm really excited to share my experience and, more importantly, have you share your experiences and why you're so passionate about this. So
Wow,
James, can you please tell us, how did you get to where you are today? What is James Wilks' story?
Well, sort of a mix of things, right? So, early on, I left Bournemouth University in England after I finished my degree to come to the States for 6 months. So I was planning on just being here for 6 months. I came to train with the guy that developed the unarmed combat program for the Navy SEALs. And so I was really into martial arts and self-defense, and I'd studied a bunch of martial arts and thought, that would sort of be the pinnacle of it was coming out to train with this guy. And so I moved out here. The training was great. The weather was great, out in Orange County, California, coming from England, which is a lot of rain sometimes and a bit gray. Although there's certainly some nice weather there sometimes. But just really enjoyed it here. The martial arts training was superior at the time. I'm not saying that it is anymore necessarily, but and so I've been here 20 years now, and I just I was teaching self-defense to the military and law enforcement and civilians. And that was my main focus. But every year or so, I'd have a fight or two in mixed martial arts because it was the closest thing. It wasn't ever my focus, but it was like the closest thing that I could do. And as I was turning 30 in 2008, I thought, well, I don't want to look back and say I could have been in the UFC. So I was telling my roommate, so I could beat all those guys on the Ultimate Fighter. And they said, okay, let's see. So I did the Ultimate Fighter. I won that in the welterweight division, fought in the UFC for a couple of years. Got injured, started looking into nutrition for optimal recovery of performance, came across a study about the Roman gladiators. They analyzed the bones. They could tell they're eating, almost exclusively plants. And I thought, well, that can't be true because we need meat and animal products to be strong and healthy. So I'd set out on this journey, which took a long time, to make the documentary with my partner, Joseph Pace, the other producer, and which became The Game Changers. And so that's sort of, that's been the story of getting to where I am now.
I can totally relate. I'm from the East Coast, and once you move to the West Coast, there's really no going back. Southern California weather is one of a kind. So I would love for you to share sort of your experience when you first made the transition to a plant-based diet, because I know I can relate to it. I think sometimes it's really hard for someone that's never done it to really try to buy into it, but it's the clarity, it's the energy, and there's just so many good things to it. So I would love to hear sort of, how do you share that experience to someone that has never tried it and maybe they're a little bit unwilling to try it?
Yeah, I mean, for me, again, so when we talk about plant-based, it's hard. There's not a super clear definition around that. And so people could say, oh, well, it's just vegan. And as a vegan, you could eat Oreos and soda and, white bread. And so that's obviously not what we're talking about, right? We're talking about, whole plant foods as much as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Not that there isn't room for plant foods that aren't whole at all, but, focusing on whole plant foods. And I mean, for me, my endurance improved significantly. My strength also went up. I mean, in the film, we show how, I went on my ropes. I went from 8 minutes up to an hour on the
Yeah,
battling
that was
ropes, which,
crazy.
some people think that I just made that up, but that's what happened. I mean, it's 6 weeks after I went completely plant-based. And before that, I sort of transitioned over time. So I took out red meat, started eating more plant-based foods, took out chicken, took out dairy, then fish, then finally eggs, I think it was, over the space of like a period of like a couple of months. And then after going completely plant-based, I definitely felt better endurance, faster recovery, and then my strength as well. My strength went up. I've never had a very strong bench press, so I was, some people say, "Oh, this is heavy," and some people laugh and say that's really light. But I was on 105-pound dumbbells in each hand for 5 reps, and I've been stuck on it for a couple of years. After I switched, I went to 115 pounds for 6 reps, 3 sets. And so nothing really changed except for my diet. And so I attribute it to that. And I think there's a lot of research. Of course, that's just anecdotal. There's a lot of research that sort of you can infer from and suggest why that might be the case. Better blood flow, better oxygen, better nutrients to the muscles, faster recovery from workouts, so you can work out again more efficiently the next time. And it's the sort of same message that's come from all of the athletes that we filmed. A lot of the athletes we filmed didn't even make it into the cut of the actual documentary, unfortunately. It's hard to fit everything in an hour and a half, which is sort of where you need to be at for a documentary.
Hmm.
And it was this sort of resounding message over and over again is, it was the recovery aspect and then less inflammation. And that's what I experienced as well.
Yeah, and I think even to take it another step further is just how you feel immediately after eating. Because for me, I
Oh,
prefer working out when I'm fasting. I just feel lighter. I feel
yeah.
quicker. If I eat a big meal, I'll feel myself just dragging ass, and then yawning, and it's hard to push it. And really, this all came back to I did a backpacking trip in South America back in September, and I got sick on like the second day. And I mean, there could have been so many factors to it, right? We're hitting altitude, could have been the water. But I just said, all right, I'm just going to take out the protein because I don't trust it. And then all I did was eat just whole foods, vegetables, fruits, good complex carbs. And the hikes on day 3 and day 4 after lunch, I was just at the front of the line and it was okay. I just pounded down so much food, but 15 minutes went by and it feels like I'm fasting again. It feels like I'm hitting a workout right after fasting. And I think that's why I've completely bought into it. It's because I love intermittent fasting. Now when I eat meals, it just feels like, okay, I could do a sprint session 15 minutes after I work out.
Yeah, definitely. And I think people in the past haven't realized how short-term effect it can have. So people
Hmm.
will think, oh, well, it takes a long time of eating a certain way. And certainly there's obviously benefits to eating the same way in a healthy way over time. But as you see in the film, there's very short-term benefits as well. So it's not just waiting until whether you have a heart attack at 70 or 80. Each meal that you eat has an impact on your blood flow, on your inflammation, on how you feel. And so, with the blood flow, for example, it's been shown that, within a couple of hours, the meal that you eat can affect your blood flow, right? And then that lasts for 6 to 8 hours. And of course, what do people usually do again after like 6 hours? They eat again, right? And so you're constantly in this state of like impairing your endothelial function, that artery of the lining of your arteries, which produces nitric oxide and prostaglandin. These are vasodilators. They allow your arteries to open up and just get more oxygen, more nutrients to the muscles and other organs as well. And so just that factor alone, we see a very sort of acute or short-term benefit or disbenefit depending on what you're eating. A heavy
Hmm.
animal-based meal, impairing that blood flow and then just sort of making you feel heavier and slower versus a plant-based meal. Um, making you feel sharper and having better endurance.
Since you've changed your fuel source, I'm curious, has that changed now how and when you eat? So, now that you're eating a little bit more plant-based and like we spoke about earlier, like whole foods, because yeah, you could smash Oreos, but let's be honest, no one should be having a really good workout after smashing a ton of Oreos.
Right.
But now that you've changed your fuel source, how has that impacted when you feel, like, have you seen changes where, okay, now it's opened up different opportunities for when you can eat and how much you eat compared to maybe in the past?
Well, I think I get to eat a little bit more volume of food, but I think I tend not to eat now until I work out fasted in the morning.
Hmm.
Often, not every day, and so I sometimes I'm not even eating till I don't know 10 a.m. But I don't know if that's because of the plant-based thing. I just sort of, didn't, maybe, I mean, I just didn't feel like I needed to fuel up in the morning.
Hmm.
And then also I'd heard the benefits about the intermittent fasting, of which, in fact, our chief science advisor is sort of a bit of an expert on fasting and intermittent fasting. And so he's advised that, I think combining plant-based eating with intermittent fasting is probably the way to go for, athletic benefit and health benefits as well. Um, but yeah, I just I'm not competing professionally anymore,
Hmm.
so I don't count calories, I don't count protein, I just eat sort of maybe 4 times a day, um, but I don't sort of focus on it too much.
Okay.
I don't. Yeah.
And then you mentioned that you're able to eat a little bit more volume, maybe. And maybe that's also, like you said, not competing at the same level that you once were. But do you find yourself now able to eat a larger meal at the end of the night? Because I know, just for me, sounds like you do some intermittent fasting as well. But I have no problem with eating a very big meal up until 10 o'clock at night, because I know eventually I'll be hungry in the morning. I know I'm going to train in the morning and fast in the morning. And there's always this like bias and this pushback, right? Because I grew up where you had to have dinner at 6 p.m. or 6:30
Hmm.
p.m. And it's just not realistic with my work schedule right now, as well as my
Right.
wife's. So do you find yourself eating a large meal at the end of the night, or are you even concerned about that?
It just varies. Sometimes I'd finish eating by 7. Sometimes I'm still eating something at 11. So it just depends. It depends. I think it really depends on how much I've worked out. If I
Okay.
work out with stuff early in the day, I'm just still hungry.
Yeah.
So it just varies. And I don't. I do think for people that are trying to lose weight, trying to shift their calories, there seems to be some research showing shifting their calories earlier in the day can be beneficial. But again, I think I think it's people overemphasize this. Not eating after 6 or 7. I think it's overemphasized. I think there's probably some benefits to some people, um, but I think it's more important what you eat than trying to time it. So if you think that you can just eat a bunch of crap as long as you're done by 6, because of course one of the benefits is if you just stop eating at 6, is that maybe you're just forcing yourself to eat less calories. But
Yeah.
in terms of adherence and people sticking to it, um, is that sustainable? Because like caloric restriction, if you're trying to lose weight, if you're doing it because you just got to force yourself and you're hungry and hungry and hungry all the time, and you're trying to, people are overweight and they're trying to lose weight, you can do that for a short period of time and say, well, I'm just not going to eat after 5 o'clock or whatever. But, is that sustainable in the long term? And most people that are trying to diet, they're often yo-yoing up and down, right? And so
Yeah.
it's really finding what's sustainable for you. And again, for a lot of people trying to cut out some body fat, one of the benefits of plant-based eating is the lower caloric density of foods, right? So that allows you to eat more and hit your stretch receptors earlier before you're too full. Now, of course, if you're trying to gain weight, then you want to eat higher calorically dense foods. So like more nuts and seeds, and maybe dried fruit, um, dates and things like that. That's going to help, get those calories in before you've hit those stretch receptors. So you can just change what you're eating, still eating mostly, whole plant foods, and get the benefits either way, rather than thinking, oh, it's just about the time that I eat, or I've got to force myself to only eat 2,000 calories today,
Yeah, it's sometimes just keeping it a little bit more simple makes more sense. And if you're still hungry, you should eat. I know for
Yeah.
me, after the holidays, it's like, all right, I'm going to even stretch out this fasting a little bit longer because I definitely overate. But like you said, there's just not a long-term sustainable approach, because eventually, if you're doing fasting for really long hours and you're in a high caloric deficit, you're going to be feeling that hunger, and you're gonna have a hard time controlling it, especially if you're not preparing with the foods that you're cooking and you're making a game plan. So I want to dive into this a little bit. Excuse me, but we already talked about some of the pushbacks, right? Or some of these things where maybe we need to debunk it a little bit. Stop eating at 6, or count all your calories. In regards to whole food, plant-based diets, what would you say is probably the most common pushback or the bias that you're having to argue with or that you're trying to debunk and educate the person on?
I think it's got to be protein, right? So
Yeah.
it's both. Again, you'll see it in the Joe Rogan podcast and also on some people attempting to debunk the film online, both protein quality and protein quantity. Um, and so, I think there's an overemphasis on protein for many people. They just think you need to jam loads of protein. And certainly people competing and being athletic do need more protein than someone who's sedentary. But by the same mechanism, they're also eating more food. And so when you eat more food, if the percentage of protein is the same, you get more protein. But I do think on the other side, you've got sort of these vegan people that are saying, oh, don't worry about protein at all. And I don't think that's true either. Like if your goal is to build as much muscle as possible, as fast as possible, and that's necessarily the healthiest thing to do. But let's say that's your goal. If you just take meat off your plate and eat what's left, like rice and vegetables, then you are going to have, suboptimal protein levels. So I think there's a balance of like making sure if you're trying to build muscle, making sure you are eating more protein dense foods from the plant kingdom. So, legumes like beans, peas, lentils, nuts and seeds. And although things like broccoli are very high in protein percentage wise, you'd have to eat like, tubs and tubs of broccoli to get enough protein. So that's another sort of thing that a lot of vegans will use. Say, oh, well, protein's got more calorie than beef. Well, it's true per calorie, but how much broccoli do you have to eat? Like, plates and plates of it. So
Yeah.
I think eating more like lentils, beans, peas, nuts and seeds. And again, I don't know why there's this sort of double standard. Like if, in one case, there are cases where protein powder might be valuable. So if you need to be in a caloric deficit, like whether you've got a competition coming up or you're just trying to go to the beach in the summer and you only got 2 months. And so you're in a caloric deficit. Well, when you're in a caloric deficit, your protein needs do go up because of gluconeogenesis. You're drawing some of that protein to use for fuel. And then you're working out more. And so there are cases, I don't know why it is that for vegans that are saying, oh, this is a problem now. You're going to have some protein powder, but like most of the protein powder that's sold is whey protein. Well, vegans aren't eating that, so where's that going? I mean, a lot of athletes are over 50% of amateur athletes and a higher percentage for elite athletes are taking protein and supplements anyway. Again, for most people, not necessary, but in certain cases, you could always do that.
Do you supplement any sort of plant-based protein powder?
I do occasionally, only if I just felt like, oh, I didn't ruin my day, but I'm not routinely and not every day.
Okay.
So like my shake, I do have a smoothie pretty much every day. And it's 750 calories, 35 grams of protein and has no protein powder in it.
Okay. So there is one thing that we do count. I feel like everyone can relate to that. You have that one go-to meal where you do know the macros, or all right, at least let me get this in and I can dial this in.
Yeah, I mean, I just like the smoothie, and so I just ran it one day on Chronometer. So it's not like I tracked my daily calories, but I know what some of my meals, like for example, a super simple thing is I'll just make a bunch of lentil pasta and then a bunch of the mixed veg, like Normandy vegetables or whatever, frozen.
Yeah.
Just cook a bunch of that. So that takes about 15 minutes to do both of those, and you can have that for lunch for like 4 or 5 days. And maybe throw on a bit of dressing or avocado or whatever, just super simple, right? And I know that's got, like the meal I have there has like over 30 grams of protein in it. So I just tend to occasionally, just sort of more out of interest, but I'm not counting my calories on a daily basis.
It's very challenging to do. It's just not realistic. If we're going to go back to what's sustainable long-term, it's this 100% rule, or, I like to live by like an 85-15% rule. And if you're trying to count your calories 100% of the time, you're not going to have friends and family happy on weekends every now and then.
Yeah, totally.
But there is something about cooking plant-based. I feel like it is a little bit more efficient and it can be easier, especially if you plan with it. But also, I just want to point out, like, when I made the transition in January, there's still something about getting over this hump with feeling like you need enough protein. I love how, you've talked about it in the film, you talked about it on Joe's show, but the average person, as long as you're eating enough, you're probably more than likely getting enough protein, especially if you're eating good
Totally.
foods. And for the most part, I just think anyone that is concerned about their protein intake is probably already getting too much protein intake.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's true. It's again, it's like there's both sides of the coin, right? So most people are eating too much protein already,
Hmm.
but then there are, so the problem is when people are trying to debunk the film, they're basically choosing a very narrow subset. So most people in the world are not professional bodybuilders, right? So they're not trying to pack on as much as possible, much muscle as fast as possible, right? And so, having like that, some people think there's issues with having too much leucine because it ignites the mTOR pathway and increases IGF-1. Potentially, a lot of people think that that could increase your cancer risk. So is trying to tell your body to grow as fast as possible the healthiest thing, right? But then you've got to recognize, well, some people don't care about their health as much. Like if you're playing football or doing the MMA or, you're a professional bodybuilder, you're probably not doing things that are optimal for longevity, right, and health.
Hmm.
And so maybe you take that into account. But yeah, most people, even in most sports, they're not trying to build as much muscle as fast as possible. So there are these numbers, 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram, or you could go even more specific and say, okay, this person's cutting weight, so they need to be in a caloric deficit, but they need to maintain muscle or even build a little bit during this phase. Now you're in a smaller niche, even again, of people that might need to count their calories or really think about the protein. So yeah, for most people, vast majority of people don't need to worry about it. Just eat, a variety of whole plant foods and you're going to be fine. But again, there are some people for certain sports or certain situations where they should think about it a little bit more. But I agree that there's a sort of overemphasis on protein as a macronutrient,
Hmm.
as it is. And then with veganism or plant-based eating, people are again more concerned, can be overly concerned as well.
And then I also want to pick your brain about the concern with carbs. There's sometimes people demonize carbs. I think for athletes, there isn't so much concern about the intake of carbs because we know it's energy. Like I've personally felt so much better going with a little bit higher carb diet and then cutting back on the protein. But I feel like the average person has a hard time understanding that. Have you gotten any pushback about that, or how do you sort of go about that topic?
Yeah, again, I think the issue that's happened, the problem that's happened, well, first of all, people have really attacked certain micronutrients over time. Like it's the fat, it's the carbs. But I think one of the major issues around carbs is people has lumped it all into one. So they've
Hmm.
lumped in white bread and white sugar with sweet potatoes and oats and bananas, right? Those two things, those are very different things, like on different ends of the spectrum. So one is spiking your blood sugar, and causing fat gain. One is like helping actually reduce it. One is calorically dense, and one isn't calorically dense. One has fiber, one doesn't have fiber. So they're very different types of foods. And actually, one of the criticisms is an interesting point because a lot of people have said, "Well, I'm sort of more sedentary. I get how carbs are good for the athletes, and they're not getting fat. But if I eat carbs, I'll get fat." So,
Hmm.
carbs in general, and coming from plant foods, like whole plant foods especially, are not associated with weight gain. They're associated with decreased waist circumference, decreased body fat percentage, time and time again. And people just shouldn't be have a phobia around consuming carbohydrates. Even if you're very sedentary, eating foods from whole plant sources are not going to make you gain weight because
Hmm.
the caloric density is low. You'll hit your stretch receptors before you overeat. So there's really no problem at all. And in terms of athletic performance, there are people doing really well on really low carbohydrate diets, really high fat diets in terms of slow, steady state. You basically increase your ability to use fat as fuel. In doing that, you decrease your ability to use carbohydrates as fuel. Um, but you're basically burning more fat as fuel, which is fine in sort of slow and steady state. So if you're doing like a really slow jog or slow run or slow bike ride, you can actually do well on high fat as well and low carb. But for the vast majority of sort of sports, you're going to be better off having a good uh, majority of your calories actually coming over 50% coming from carbohydrates.
And I think this just reinforces the idea that a flexible diet is the best diet. to try to lock in the same exact ratio of fats versus carbs versus
Yeah.
protein for the same person 365 days out of the year. It's just not realistic because, like you said, if you're going to be doing a low bike ride, well, and there's a certain fuel source that may be the best for that. But if you're going to be jumping into a soccer game, 90 minutes, repeated bouts of sprinting, maybe you want
Sure.
to include some carbs and some other different fuel sources.
Yeah, and just to sort of reiterate what I was saying there, I'm not saying there's never been shown that the high fat, low carb would be better. It
Hmm.
would just like they can probably do equivalent as a higher carb, on certain types of exercise. But overall, you're just way better. There's never a case that I've seen in any studies where the high fat, low carb is doing better if those carb sources are good carb sources, right? If
Hmm.
you're just punching a bunch of sugar and white flour, then sure, you might have been better off swapping those out, because everything's always compared to what, right? Whether you're talking about health, athletic performance, when people say, oh, but look over here, these people on a higher fat group did better than these people on a higher carb group. Yeah, okay, well, let's look at what the carbs were.
Hmm.
It's important. It's like, what are you comparing it to? Because
Yeah.
you can show like, oh, eggs don't increase cholesterol. Okay, what were they comparing it to? Oh, well, they stopped eating bacon instead. Oh, well, there you go. It's like you got to be. It's always compared to what. It's not just in
Yeah.
isolation.
And people only want to read or hear the surface. And I think
Right.
that's what can be challenging is everyone has a bias and it's based on previous experiences or personal preferences, but you can't just read or investigate just the surface. You really need to dive into the stuff and sometimes challenge your biases. So we polled our audiences and I'd love to hear your take on this. So a few questions rolled in and it was the same one. So say that someone is unwilling to give up some animal based food sources. What options would potentially have the least adverse effects, if any? Like, am I even proposing a logical and possible question? And then, with that being said, is there anything that people should supplement with or eat at the same time?
Right. Okay. So I mean, there's two answers. Look, there's two perspectives on this. I think one is from a physiological perspective, and one is from a sort of behavioral perspective. So if you're talking about physiologically, which would be the least harmful animal foods, I certainly think it would be like wild caught game. So wild caught deer is shown to be, wild caught kangaroo, for example, has less inflammation than beef. Still has inflammation, and your body can recover from these sort of insults, right? So if you're only having it occasionally, and that's why I would still say if someone is eating, let's say you're eating a bit of wild caught salmon once a month, and you eat turkey on Thanksgiving, right? And the rest of the time you're eating plants, I would still call that a plant-based diet, essentially,
Hmm.
right? So people are saying, oh, well, you made this film about, so the athletes in the film were vegan, only because we didn't want people saying, oh, it's the fish that they eat once a month that gives them the protein, right? But in terms of plant-based diets, that could include a little bit of animal products, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so, yeah, from a physiological point of view, I think eating wild-caught game um, that's lower in saturated fat, that doesn't have the hormones added, that's hopefully got less persistent organic pollutants, that's got less pesticides. People don't realize, I saw a post on Instagram the other day on a comment on one of my posts, and someone saying, oh yeah, well, what about all the pesticides and the persistent organic pollutants that just don't go away? They just sort of keep coming back into the cycle. In plant foods, what people don't realize that, number one, the plant foods are fed to the animals and they bioaccumulate and biomagnify up the food chain, right? And number two, the plant foods that are fed to animals are not human grade. So they can actually have higher levels of pesticides because they don't have the same rulings. And so sort of the more wild you can get, and if you're talking about fish, right, the smaller fish you get, the better, the
Hmm.
lower on the food chain, right? So the basic premise, or one of the basic premises, is getting your nutrients from as low on the food chain as possible, right? So if someone say, well, I need to have I need to have DHA or EPA omega-3s. Well, where did the fish get them from? They get them from algae. So instead of taking a fish oil, you could take an algae-based oil supplement, if you even feel that you need that. I mean,
Hmm.
some people just do fine having a tablespoon of flaxseed a day. They get enough ALA and they convert it. But if you feel like you need a fish oil, why would you do that when you could get an algae-based oil? But eating as low on the food chain as possible. If it's fish, getting the smallest, low on the food chain, the smaller fish, because they've eaten less fish, so they're getting less bioaccumulation. And wild caught, like kangaroo meat or like wild deer or something. So that's on the physiological end, right?
Okay.
But on the behavioral sort of answer to me would be eat what you really like and just try and minimize it. So if someone said to me at a screening once, well, yeah, but I always go and have sushi, raw fish sushi once a month with my buddies. Okay, well, do that then.
Yeah.
But don't let that make an excuse to not eat more plant-based the rest of the time. Or I was at the gym the other day. Someone had seen the film. They came up to me. They said, "Man, I really want to go plant-based, but I'm in a habit of eating egg whites every morning for breakfast." So, okay, eat egg whites for morning every day for breakfast.
Yeah.
Don't let that stop you from making it more of a shift. So I think there's the physiological answer and the behavioral answer. I think you shouldn't feel it. It shouldn't feel like deprivation. So I would eat what you like, and then minimize that. And again, it's not. We like to say it's all or something, not all or nothing. And shifting more in a plant-based direction has been shown to have benefits, whether it's from omnivorous to pescatarian to vegetarian to vegan, more whole plant foods, or just increasing the amount of legumes and fruits and vegetables in each dish and then throughout the week.
Yeah. Quality of life, right? It's
Yeah.
everything in moderation. And if you're concerned, try to cut back on it a little bit. Like, for instance, this month, I already treated myself to sardines. I was very excited to have sardines. That's just one of my go-to things.
Sure.
And then I still haven't tried anything else yet, but I'm excited to do eggs. I just want to slowly incorporate stuff, and I'm just being mindful. But I grew up 29 years on meat, so I need to, that's part of my lifestyle. It's part of my habits. I'm just a little bit more mindful, and I'm definitely going to be incorporating more of a plant-based diet, whole food plant-based diet moving forward, because I just can't deny the anecdotal measurements of how I feel. And I mean, I did strength testing at the beginning of the year. I did strength testing last week, and I maintained everything. If not, I did better while improving my lean body composition and
Right.
some of other markers. Like, I'm waiting to get back some blood biomarkers. I'll be excited to maybe connect with you on some of those, because, and I want to get into that a little bit, is just, okay, well, what if some of those biomarkers that you want to be improving aren't improving? Like, what should you supplement with, or maybe what are some of the signs and symptoms that you need to be mindful of if you're trying to do this transition? So, but yeah, I definitely recommend everyone to try it. There's a lot more to gain than there is to lose. I think we could all agree there.
Yeah, definitely. And also, you're asking, like, is there anything that you should eat with something or supplement?
Yeah.
Now, did you mean if you're going to eat animal products, things that you should eat with it to offset it,
Yeah,
or did you mean like in general, if you're going a plant-based, what should you supplement, or both of those questions?
Why don't we cover both, if that's okay with you?
So I would say, yeah. So the first thing is, when you're going to eat animal foods, it seems very clear that you should definitely eat lots of plant foods with it. So, for example, there was a study we used in the film, and people have given us crap for it because they said, "Oh, well, it was funded by the avocado industry," and we didn't even mention the avocado stuff. It was just a study that showed that markers of IL-6, which is a marker of inflammation, went up when people ate a burger. We didn't even mention the fact that when you ate it with the avocado, it nullified a lot of that inflammation, so it offset a lot of that. But people tended to try to pick on us for using a study funded by the avocado board, even though we didn't talk about the avocado or the benefits of it. And it's sort of shown again and again that when you eat plant foods with animal foods, it can offset some of that inflammation. The inflammation from the heme iron or from the AGEs or any of these sort of inflammatory molecules that might be coming. So that would be the first thing. I would not recommend eating just the animal products by itself. The worst situation would be eating a bunch of meat and then having a bunch of sugar and white flour with that meat. That would be the worst situation. But eating whole plant foods with meat would be, a better situation than just having the meat alone. And then in terms of supplementing, so if you're on a completely plant-based diet or very nearly exclusively plant-based, certainly getting B12 is the one thing that everybody should be doing. Again, I'm not a dietitian, so I don't want to give people recommendations, but you could go on nutritionfacts.org and look at their recommendations for amounts. You can do it daily. You can do it once a week. You just require quite a bit more based on the way that it breaks down and is absorbed. And then vitamin D, there's, meat eaters and vegans alike can be low in vitamin D. It depends on where you live, time of year, so you might want to look at that. Interestingly, there's a study showing that if you have your vitamin D supplement with the largest meal of the day, it can increase your vitamin D blood levels by up to 50%. So eating it with food. And then obviously vitamins A, D, E, and K are fat soluble, so always having a bit of fat with that. Same with lycopene and beta carotene, the carotenoids, eating those with a little bit of fat. So if you're having a salad, both for the sort of fat soluble vitamins and the carotenoids, it's a good idea to have a bit of fat with it. If you're eating a salad, like maybe some walnuts or avocado, again, those whole food sources are going to be better than oils. Even though people think that olive oil is healthy, whole food fats are going to be better. So that's a better example. And then people worry about combining foods. If you're having iron-rich foods, having those with something with vitamin C in it, like tomatoes or lemon juice or something, can have some sort of benefit there as well. And then the last supplement that people consider, again, we talked about the EPA and DHA, supplement for either fish oil or I think obviously it would be better to have an algae-based oil supplement. And it's just questionable whether you require that. So there's an enzyme called delta-6 desaturase, which is competed for by both omega-6s and omega-3s. So if you're having a bunch of safflower oil and sunflower oil or oils high in omega-3s, it's using some of that delta-6 desaturase, which elongates the short chains. So if you'd have flaxseed, you have ALA, right, or walnut, you're having ALA, and it needs to convert that into DHA and EPA. But if you're having a bunch of omega-6 oils, then that delta-6 desaturase is sometimes being used up and competing for that, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So if you're having a bunch of omega-6s, absolutely, I think you should probably, again, I'm not a dietitian, I'm not giving any one specific person advice, but then I would certainly consider having an algae-based DHA and EPA supplement. And then if you're not having many omega-6s, that delta-6 desaturase is probably freed up to convert the ALA into DHA and EPA. And then it's just questionable whether you really need that. Certainly as you get older, you lose less ability to convert that potentially. But so that's another thing that people consider as an algae-based DHA and EPA supplement.
That's great packed info. I think what I'll do is I'll follow up with you and we can include some of this in the show notes. But one small quick takeaway is maybe bring an avocado to the tailgate if you're going to be eating some tailgate.
Yeah, for sure. That's a good idea.
So what I would like to finish up with are a couple more questions. I'm sure people have connected with you so much in the past few months. A lot of people probably showing interest in how they can incorporate more of a whole food, plant-based diet. Like, what are some of the easiest actionable steps that limit the amount of failure and improve the greatest rate of success for people trying out this type of diet?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I would say anytime you're changing a habit like this is don't set yourself up for failure. If you say, I'm going to go 100% and I'm not going to eat any meat for the next month, like for some people that works, but for a lot of people, then they end up, doing it and they feel like a failure and then they don't carry on. So don't set the goals too high. And if you do fall off, don't worry about it. Just eat better the next day. So that's one thing. Second thing is I would try and find plant foods that you already eat and enjoy and maybe eat that a little bit more. So if you ate like a peanut butter and banana sandwich once a week before, maybe eat that twice a week, try and find things that you already eat that are plant-based. Then find recipes that you already eat that can just be shifted a little bit. So like, for example, in some recipes, instead of using an egg, you can use like 3 tablespoons of flaxseed 3 teaspoons of flaxseed and 1 teaspoon of water and mix that up, let it coagulate. You can use that instead of an egg. Or maybe instead of a chili, instead of a beef chili, you have a 3-bean chili, or you put lentils in instead of minced meat in something. So I'd find recipes that you can switch over. And then the last thing is trying to find, new plant-based dishes that you're willing to try and give it a try. And try and keep it simple. If you come up with like these things that like takes 2.5 hours to cook and Might taste really great, but it's too much of a hassle. That might not work for a lot of people. So just try and find simple things, make enough so that you've got enough over for lunch for the next day. And just try and keep it simple, and don't worry about making a shift all at once for most people. Some people can do it, but for other people, maybe shifting over time. And don't think about exclusion so much as more incorporating more plant-based meals, and that'll push out some of the animal-based meals.
I like that. More inclusion versus exclusion. And
Yeah.
yeah, it was challenging as hell. I won't lie. Like we traveled 2 out of the 4 weekends in January, and we did a business trip. We were up in San Francisco. We went to a bar for the Niners game. Mike is a big Niners fan. And to be committed to a sports bar at 5 p.m. for about 3.5 hours, you can imagine you're limited with the menu. So it was definitely delayed gratification to say that we did it, but you got to prepare. And I would definitely recommend you have to cook if you're trying to eat out. I mean, we're in Southern California, so I think there's definitely more options here, but different places in the world, it may be more challenging if you're trying to eat out more versus cook more. So preparation.
Yeah, no, definitely traveling is one of the big things. I do take some stuff with me. You've also got to try and find places like, Flame Broiler or Chipotle, or there's a new place called Carver down here, which is like a Mediterranean type thing. Like there's a lot of places where you can go, and now they're offering plant-based options. And then even in a restaurant, like I find where there's no plant-based options on the menu, sometimes say to the server, hey, is there something that the chef could make me that's plant-based? And sometimes the chefs actually enjoy that because it's a bit of a challenge. It's not so routine. And they sort of want to impress you with what they can do. So I think things are changing. There's more things available.
Definitely.
And I do think it's getting easier. But yeah, it's definitely a challenge. It's not it's a bit challenging in the beginning. Once you get used to it, then it just becomes normal.
You have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, and that comes with any change. I mean, it can be anything, not even diet related. It's just it's a challenge, but delayed gratification. All right, James, I want to finish up with this. We ask this to every single person that comes on the show. What does prehab mean to you? And we can talk a little bit about the diet. We can talk about the interesting field that you're in. I mean, training elite special forces personnel. What does prehab mean to you?
I mean, prehab for me is being, doing things ahead of time, right? Not waiting until there's something wrong. You don't want to wait till you've got the injury or wait till you're sick, or, get ahead of the game and be prepared and fuel and train your body in a way that you're going to be ready for whatever goals and whatever things might arise.
Couldn't agree more. All right, James, thank you so much for your time today. I know everyone's going to enjoy this one. I'm excited to get this one out.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this podcast with James and I. I hope it opened your mind to being a little bit more willing to try a whole food plant-based diet. You don't have to go 100% in like I did, and I've already incorporated some eggs and fish and meat on occasion into my diet, but I promise you it is definitely worth trying because the results speak for themselves. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast. It would mean the world to us. Drop a comment, let us know what you want to hear, and we'll definitely record it. All right, take care.